It's John, and this is one of my favorites. Every so often, the Order of the Phoenix survived not through great wizards or grand plans, but through two red-headed shopkeepers and a cellar full of very bad ideas. One locked shop, one dark lord. And before the night was out, roughly a dozen Harry Potters. The decoy detonator wriggled out of Fred's sack at the precise moment George was explaining in some detail why it absolutely could not. It hit the cobbles on 6 brass legs, shook itself like a wet terrier, and shot beneath the locked door of the village apothecary before either of them could grab it. From inside came a bang with the crisp authority of a very small cannon. Blue smoke curled out through the keyhole, arranged itself unhurriedly into the words, "Good evening, criminals," and drifted apart. Fred considered the door. The lettering, he decided, had improved since the last batch. George was more concerned about the timing, which had always been the weak point of that particular product. They had never meant to be in Little Hangleton after dark. They had meant to take a shortcut, a phrase used chiefly by people already lost who wished to sound entrepreneurial about it. Their sack held rejected prototypes, damaged stock, and 3 items George had labeled "Do Not Lick," though Fred maintained that one of them improved enormously when licked. The street lay empty under crooked roofs, every window shuttered against a thin October drizzle. Behind the apothecary door, several men stopped talking at once. A bolt scraped back. "Customer," Fred whispered hopefully. "Complaint," George whispered more accurately. The door opened 3 inches on a slice of white mask, and one black-gloved hand and a wand tip poked out into the rain. A voice behind it wanted to know who was there. Fred lifted his chin into the wounded expression of a tradesman unfairly questioned by the public and offered the word delivery. George amended it to collection. Between them they settled, after some negotiation, on confidential delivery and collection, highly confidential, and Fred's final contribution, embarrassingly confidential. The mask did not move. It asked what had exploded. "A complimentary sample," said Fred. The wand tip drifted towards his nose and asked, "Of what?" George leaned around his brother's shoulder to supply the answer, "Disappointment." The door slammed. Bolts rattled home one after another, and then came footsteps and the scrape of furniture dragged across a floor in a hurry. The twins looked at each other and bent over the sack together, and somewhere inside the building, the decoy detonator gave a muffled, self-satisfied hoot. They could still leave, George pointed out sensibly, quietly, though his hands were already sorting through boxes. Without discovering why, 4 masked lunatics were holding a secret meeting in an abandoned chemist's. He had counted 3 voices, actually. 3, he said. A 4th shouted, "Find them!" 4, George allowed. The apothecary windows did not shatter so much as vanish, cut out in a neat circle by a severing charm. A Death Eater climbed through with the slow dignity of a man expecting to be feared, and landed with both boots in a crate of bath sponges. The crate gave way. Pink sponges erupted around his ankles and squeaked with every step, and when a second masked figure hissed at him to stop making that noise, the first one looked down and said, with genuine dignity, that it wasn't him. Fred came up from the sack with 2 wands still wearing their price labels. "Emergency equipment," he explained, handing one over. a prototype returned by a dissatisfied customer for reasons of excessive realism. George took it without asking further questions, which was usually wiser. The first Death Eater raised his wand, and the twins raised theirs, and for one clean second the street went very quiet. Rain ticked on the roof tiles. The masked wizard's real wand hung steady, aimed square between them, and neither twin grinned or shifted his feet. From inside the apothecary, a low voice was still talking about an order courier, a road north, and instructions that had come down from someone none of them would name aloud. The wand twitched downward. Fred fired first, and his fake wand turned into a rubber haddock. The fish sailed from his hand, slapped the Death Eater full across the mask, and bellowed, "Mind the bones," in the voice of an outraged railway porter. George's became a bouquet of daffodils, every bloom fitted with small snapping teeth, and the flowers fastened themselves to the black robes and chanted, "Lovely complexion, lovely complexion," while their owner reeled backwards over the squeaking sponges. Fred grabbed his brother's sleeve, told him to run professionally, and they bolted down the lane like two burglars pursued by murderous gardening. Green light struck the wall beside them and flung brick across the street. A fragment tore the sack, and half a dozen canary creams bounced away over the cobbles. Fred slid in behind a stone trough with George dropping beside him, both hands clamped over the torn canvas, and a second curse split the rim of the trough and showered them with icy water and stone chips. Fred's fingers found a small purple tin at the bottom of the sack. "Those hadn't been tested," George breathed, reading the label, which Fred considered the best possible reason to use them, since the Death Eaters wouldn't know what to expect either. He lobbed it over the trough. It burst at their pursuers' feet and let loose 12 spare noses in assorted sizes, colors, and degrees of indignation. They sprang into the air on tiny wings, sniffed once, and set upon the nearest faces with the enthusiasm of starving pigeons. One clamped itself over a mask and sneezed thunderously into the man's eyes. Another latched onto a hood and began shouting, "Suspicious smell, suspicious smell." A third, enormous, purple, and evidently the flagship of the range, chased the leader in tight circles while performing a nasal rendition of "God Save the Queen." That one was new, George observed, scrambling up. "The patriotic range," said Fred, who had assured him only last week that it merely hummed. It had, he admitted, gained confidence. They pelted past the apothecary as 2 more Death Eaters spilled out, swatting at airborne noses and skidding on canary creams. A masked witch put her heel through one cake and disappeared in a puff of feathers. Where she'd stood, a large yellow canary flapped furiously inside a set of black robes, the mask balanced sideways across its beak. The wizard beside her stared, the canary stared back, and then bit him on the thumb. At the apothecary window, the decoy detonator reappeared. It had acquired a small black hat from somewhere and was hauling a roll of parchment twice its own length. On sighting the twins, it drew itself up, saluted, stamped the parchment with a smear of red ink, and flung itself through the circular hole. The scroll unrolled across the wet street behind it, and George caught one glimpse. Names, a route through the village, the words, "Order Courier," before the little brass creature landed on his shoulder and announced that a second explosion was due in 10 seconds. There wasn't a second explosion, Fred pointed out, running faster. Then why, he wanted to know, was it counting? Marketing, said George. Behind them, every Death Eater dived for cover as the detonator reached 9, skipped without warning to 4, reconsidered, and began counting backwards in French. The canary flew into a drain pipe. The patriotic nose hit the anthem's final note with such force that 3 shutters banged open along the street. George crammed the stolen parchment into the ruined sack. Fred plucked the detonator off his shoulder, and at the far end of the lane, an old coaching inn waited with boarded windows and a sign hanging by a single chain. They ran for it as the detonator cried, "Zero!" Nothing exploded. There was a small, disappointed silence behind them. Then a Death Eater roared, "Get them!" And Fred kicked the inn door open and observed that they sounded put out. "Good thing," said George, following him in, "that they'd brought samples." The coaching inn had been abandoned so thoroughly that even the dust seemed to have packed a bag and left. Fred slammed the door. George dropped the sack on a table, which promptly collapsed with the sound of a wardrobe falling downstairs. And a startled pigeon flapped somewhere up in the rafters. "Excellent defensive position," said Fred, surveying the broken chairs, the split beams, and a fireplace stuffed with damp leaves. "Strong walls. No roof in several important areas," George noted, kicking the doorstop into place. "Ventilation," said Fred. Boots struck the lane outside, and wand light came stabbing through the cracks in the boards, green and white slivers skating across bottles, benches, and a framed print of a horse that looked personally offended by the evening's events. The twins dragged the sack behind the bar and unloaded at speed. A tin of instant eyebrows, 2 boxes of fainting fancies, a roll of extendable ears knotted together like pink spaghetti, and a parcel stamped portable swamp. "Trial size. Keep upright." That last, George said, holding it up, was the last resort. Fred glanced at the door and reckoned they'd reached third to last. The door exploded inward. Splinters whipped across the room as 3 Death Eaters charged through the smoke, and the evening rewarded them at once. The first trod on a loose floorboard, which sprang up and caught the second neatly under the chin, while the third ducked, congratulated himself a fraction too early, and walked face first into the hanging inn sign as it swung in through the broken doorway behind them. Fred leaned over the bar and welcomed them. The kitchen was closed, George added, and the bar dangerous, and the management, Fred finished, worse. A curse scorched the shelf above their heads and burst a row of old bottles, and sour rainwater sluiced down Fred's collar. George snapped open a box of Daydream charms and swept the contents into his palm. Tiny silver soap bubbles, each holding a different moving scene: a beach, a ballroom, a Quidditch pitch, and one particularly ambitious specimen containing a throne room full of applauding goblins. "They were meant to dissolve on the tongue," he said. "They would," Fred replied, improvised the tongue, and dragged a cracked soda siphon out from under the counter with the air of a man who had waited years to weaponize leisure. He funneled the charms in and worked the handle. The first pump produced a sad wheeze. The second fired a glittering spray clear across the room, hard enough to knock the hat off the offended horse. Silver bubbles burst against masks and gloves and black robes, and the inn filled with the smell of warm treacle and fresh-cut grass. One Death Eater stopped mid-curse, lowered his wand, and began to waltz gravely with a coat stand. Another threw his arms wide and cried, "At last, my adoring public," to a row of broken stools. The third managed to turn his face aside in time. "Idiots," he snarled, backing towards the door. They were illusions. Behind him, the waltzing wizard dipped the coat stand and murmured that Madame's silence wounded him. Very convincing illusions, Fred conceded. The untouched Death Eater's next curse tore the siphon out of Fred's hands and blew a hole through the bar. George dropped, rolled across the floor, and came up beside the sack with the extendable ears looped over one shoulder. A second curse cracked the wall above him and dusted his hair with plaster. For a few seconds, nobody joked. The wizard stepped over the wreckage with his wand level and steady, and Fred crouched low behind an overturned bench, one empty hand feeling along the floor. "Hands where I can see them," the Death Eater said. George raised both of his slowly. One of them still held the knotted ears. "These?" he asked, and the pink cords sprang apart. 6 rubbery ears shot across the room like fishing lines and wrapped themselves around the man's wrists, ankles, neck, wand, and one unfortunate belt buckle, and he went over backwards with a strangled shout and crashed straight into the waltzing wizard, who spun him neatly into the coat stand's wooden arms. Fred popped up from behind the bench with a jar of instant eyebrows called that he'd found these and threw. George ducked. The glass shattered against the tangled men in a black cloud of enchanted hair. Eyebrows erupted everywhere. Above masks, below masks, across foreheads, over eye holes, and in one memorable case, out of both ears. They curled into question marks and mustaches and antlers, and on the tangled leader they formed a small, perfect hedge, complete with sparrows nesting. When he sneezed, another sprouted across the bridge of his nose, and his waltzing companion gazed at him with damp admiration and whispered that his face had become magnificent. Shouting rose again from the lane, followed by the unmistakable squawk of the canary. Through the hole in the wall, George watched 2 more Death Eaters closing from the apothecary, dragging the missing end of the stolen parchment and batting spare noses aside with their cloaks. The enormous purple one still trailed them, though it had given up the anthem and moved on to loudly reviewing their personal hygiene. "Reinforcements," said George. "Customers," said Fred. "Angry ones, which was, after all, their speciality." A floorboard creaked overhead. Both twins looked up. Through a gap in the ceiling, a pair of boots shifted in the dark of the upper gallery, and the careful silence around them belonged to neither pigeon nor Death Eater. Fred laid 2 fingers on the stolen parchment inside the sack. George's eyes went to the stairs, then back to the wand light gathering outside. Neither of them said the words, "Order courier." Neither of them needed to. "Nigate." "New plan," George murmured. "Protect the person upstairs without letting on they knew the person was there, while seeing off 5 murderous lunatics with damaged joke stock." Fred reached for the portable swamp. George took it firmly away from him, third to last resort. As the windows burst inward together and Fred came up from the sack, grinning, a box of fainting fancies in his fist, and suggested the second to last. The first fancy caught the nearest Death Eater full on the mask and stuck there like a pink biscuit with ambitions. He clawed at it, breathed in a puff of sugared powder and folded backwards out of the broken window with a sigh of enormous contentment. His companion froze and demanded to know what they'd done to him. "Improved his evening?" said Fred, shaking the empty box. "Possibly his posture," said George. 3 curses crossed the room at once. One through the offended horse, one into a curtain that had been mostly mold to begin with, and one straight into the bar's brass tap. A jet of ancient butterbeer foam blasted out sideways and coated a Death Eater from shoulder to boot in beige froth. And when he tried to curse the twins, his wand produced only bubbles, each one carrying a small image of his own masked face looking progressively more annoyed. George sent 2 more fancies arcing high into the air. A witch blasted the first into a cloud of crumbs that drifted down over everyone beneath, and the second dropped tidily down. The back of her collar. She made a strangled noise, slapped at her robes, and pitched face first into a chair, which remembered it was broken and folded gently round her. "Service seemed slow tonight," Fred remarked. "Understaffed," agreed George. People kept lying down. The butterbeer-soaked wizard charged, and Fred ducked and slid a skiving snack box across the floor, like a curling stone. The lid flew open under the man's boots and scattered nosebleed nougat, fever fudge, puking pastilles, and one experimental sweet marked Mystery Tuesday, and his heel came down on 3 at once. He stopped. He sneezed sparks, came out in purple spots, and began to bring up a steady stream of brightly colored paper butterflies. They filled the inn. They fluttered into masks and clustered on wand tips, and whenever they found a clean stretch of wall, spelled out rude words. One settled on George's nose and unfolded into a tiny paper invoice informing him they'd been charged for damages. "Dispute it," said Fred, waving away a butterfly that had written bald in front of the eyebrow-covered wizard. "On what grounds?" asked George. "Excellent publicity." Outside, the first fallen Death Eater came round and hauled himself up, took one look through the window at the waltzing man, the butterflies, the beige bubbles, and the witch asleep in her broken chair, and shouted to know what was happening in there. "Private function," Fred called back. "No masks," George added. A low voice spoke from the dark above them. "Duck." They dropped together, and a red spell went over their heads into the awning above the doorway, bringing the whole rotten frame down across the entrance and burying the Death Eater outside under wet canvas and timber. A cloaked figure moved along the upper gallery, wand out through the broken rail. Good aim and no patience for explanations. "Very subtle," George called up. "More subtle than the butterflies," came the reply. "That," said Fred, "was subjective." The leader with the hedge across his face wrenched free of the extendable ears, slashed his wand through the air, and severed the pink cords and half the coat stand along with them. The waltzing wizard clutched the ruined stand to his chest, gasped, "Monster!" and tried to slap him with a wooden sleeve. Hedgeface shoved him off and turned his wand up towards the gallery, and the courier vanished behind the railing as green light scorched the wall where the shadow had been. For one breath, the room fell into hard, sudden order. Hedgeface stood steady among the foam and feathers, his wand fixed on the single stairway, while another Death Eater slid across to block the rear door. Fred's hand hung over the open sack. "Come down," the leader said very softly, or he'd burn the floor out from under them. A small packet slid along the bar and stopped between the twins. Daydream Charm. Fred read off the label, the deluxe. George turned it over and read out the dream. Personal greatness, public admiration, and hair visible from space. Cruel, said Fred, tearing it open. They fed the deluxe charm into the mouth of the decoy detonator. The little creature swallowed, shuddered from nose to tail, and began to glow gold around every rivet. That, George noted, had not been in the instructions. The detonator swelled to the size of a badger, sprouted a small velvet cape, and announced in a deep and heroic voice, "Make way for your rightful commander." Every Death Eater turned to look at it. It marched to the center of the room, leveled one brass leg at Hedgeface, and let off a golden pulse straight into his chest. His wand sank. His shoulders came back. A magnificent mane of imaginary silver hair unfurled behind him and went streaming through tables, walls, and several passing butterflies, without the faintest concern for reality. Hedgeface climbed onto the broken bar and told the room grandly that at last they recognized true leadership. When he commanded them to bow, the waltzing wizard bowed at once. The butterbeer-soaked one bowed because a butterfly had gone up his nose, and even the witch woke in her chair, saw the silver hair billowing round her leader, and dropped her head in complete bewilderment. "He's taken to it," Fred murmured. "Natural talent," said George, who doubted the man rehearsed anywhere but in mirrors. The courier came down the stairs 3 at a time, a narrow leather case strapped across the chest and rain darkening both shoulders of the traveling cloak, and said the one useful word, "back door." "Occupied," George pointed out, nodding at the guard. "Temporarily," said Fred, hefting the sack, as the decoy detonator scrambled onto Hedgeface's shoulder and bellowed for his first decree. No one, Hedgeface proclaimed, both arms raised, was to leave until they had praised his hair. The inn went quiet. Then Fred laid a hand over his heart and pronounced it majestic. "Structural," George agreed. The courier stared at the pair of them, and by the rear door, the guard turned slowly towards his leader and admitted that it did have impressive volume. "Excellent," said Fred. "Now praise it from outside." The guard opened the rear door so as to admire the hair from a respectful distance, and George rewarded this excellent decision by booting a crate across the floor and wedging it in the gap. Fred pushed the courier through, went after with the sack, and paused to bow to Hedgeface on the way. "Truly, sir, a hairstyle for the ages." "Several ages," George added, backing out, "depending on maintenance." Cold rain met them in the alley. The courier landed by an overflowing water butt and struck out north, but the twins caught the trailing cloak before 3 steps were done. Wrong direction. Masked enthusiasts coming from there. Beyond the rooftops, wand light bobbed along the lane as another pair of black robes hurried towards the inn. How many were there? The courier wanted to know. The number kept changing, said Fred. Mostly, he explained, because some of them were birds. A crash sounded behind the door, where Hedgeface had apparently learned that imaginary hair offered no protection against real furniture. His voice rose over the rest, demanding obedience, admiration, and someone to remove the brass creature currently biting his ear. The courier lifted a wand towards the mouth of the alley. They needed the north road. Conveniently, George observed, watching the approaching lights. So did the newcomers. Then, said Fred, rummaging, they'd send them south. His hand came up with two small black discs, each painted with a cheerful silver arrow and labeled, "This way and definitely this way." Though both arrows spun the instant, no one was looking directly at them. Misleading directional markers, George groaned. The earlier model had once sent Aunt Muriel into a pantry. She'd found biscuits, Fred reminded him. He slapped one disc to the wall, pointing left, and flicked the other into the gutter, pointing right. And both began whispering urgently in the voices of respected authorities. "Order courier this way," said the first, in a flawless impression of Kingsley Shacklebolt. "Secret Death Eater meeting that way," announced the second in the nasal register of Percy Weasley. The two approaching wizards stopped dead at the alley mouth between them. One arrow pointed left, the other pointed right, and the markers promptly swapped voices and began accusing each other of poor leadership. "Which was real?" the taller demanded. "Neither," said the shorter. "Exactly what the real one would say," replied Percy's voice. While they argued it out, the twins and the courier slipped behind a row of sheds to a rusted gate, chained shut and hexed to bite any hand that touched the bars. The courier tried the lock. Blue sparks crawled over it and died. "Sealed," they said. The twins specialized in sealed, Fred assured them, holding up a fake wand. "The one," George added, examining the rubber handle that turned into a chicken. "A useful chicken? A judgmental one?" Fred cracked it against the lock, and the wand popped into a plump red hen in tiny spectacles. It pecked the chain once, recoiled, gave Fred a look of profound personal disappointment, and then turned toward the oncoming Death Eaters and clucked loudly enough to rouse the whole village. "Stealth model?" the courier asked faintly. "Educational," said George, scooping it up. A curse blew through the shed behind them. Planks sailed across the alley, and one struck the gate hard enough to snap its iron teeth shut on nothing. The courier spun and fired back through the gap, driving the two Death Eaters behind a stack of barrels, while Fred dug through the sack with both arms and George kept the hen jammed under one elbow and a shield up with the other. He was choosing, Fred said, between certain embarrassment and ambitious embarrassment. The taller Death Eater stepped clear and sent a jet of red light straight at Fred. The courier knocked it wide, but the blow tore the wand from their grip and sent it skittering under the gate and out of reach into the muddy yard beyond. The shorter man came on, wand level. "End of the alley," he said. "End of the game." Fred's hand went still at the bottom of the sack. For a moment there was only the rain, boots in the mud, and the soft clucking of the hen. The taller wizard's wand rose towards the courier's chest, and George's grip on the fake chicken tightened until it squawked. And the courier stood against the biting gate with empty hands. Then the hen laid an egg. It struck the ground, split, and let out a full brass band. 12 musicians in scarlet uniforms, none taller than a teaspoon, trumpets blaring and cymbals crashing. A miniature conductor springing onto the Death Eater's boot with a cry of, "From the top, gentlemen." The hen flapped free of George's arm and took up its place at the head of the procession. The Death Eater stared down in disbelief, and his next curse hit the tuba. The tuba exploded into 37 more chickens. Feathers filled the alley in a furious red cloud. Chickens came down on shoulders, masks, wand arms, barrels, and the biting gate, which tried to chew 3 at once and jammed solid on tail feathers. Fred lunged, seized the bars, and hauled, and the gate swung open with an offended metallic groan. George caught the courier by the cloak, told them after you, and Fred, following, advised them to mind the orchestra. Did all their fake wands do that? The courier asked, snatching up the fallen wand as the little band launched into a galloping march behind them. Certainly not, said Fred, going over a rain barrel. Some, George admitted, were unreliable. The yard ended at a waist-high wall, and beyond it lay the village square, and, inconveniently, most of the remaining Death Eaters. Some were brushing feathers from their robes. One still wore the canary's beak. Another had 3 spare noses ranged along his jaw. And Hedgeface had arrived with the decoy detonator clamped under one arm like an argumentative handbag, his imaginary silver hair streaming out behind him in the rain. There, he shouted, seize them and mind the volume. He'd kept the hair, Fred noted, ducking below the wall. Commitment, said George. Between them, the courier pulled the leather case tighter and reported there was no clear route north. There would be, said Fred. Once, George added, they'd ruined the square. The sack had grown lighter, wetter, and far less organized. George tipped it out onto the mud, a cluster of extendable ears, 6 fake mustaches, a tin of Peruvian instant darkness, 2 packets of pygmy puff dandruff, and the portable swamp. Fred reached for the darkness powder, and George slapped his hand away. Roofless village. Fair point, said Fred, and then, reading the tin more closely, discovered it was not darkness powder at all, but Peruvian instant dinner. A spell struck the top of the wall and showered them with stone chips. The courier fired back, driving the nearest witch behind the dry fountain at the center of the square, while another Death Eater advanced along a boarded bakery, stepping carefully round the brass band which was now marching in circles, having lost its conductor. They couldn't hide there forever, he called. How long, Fred called back, popping up, would be inconvenient? Would 5 minutes ruin their plans? The courier dragged him down as a curse cut through the air, where his ear had been. George chose the mustaches. Each rode on a spring and came labeled by temperament. Dashing, suspicious, aristocratic, and one simply named Nigel. Distraction, he asked. Reinforcements, said Fred, taking Nigel. They fitted the 4 to broken broom handles and hoisted them over the wall, and the enchanted whiskers twitched, curled, and began issuing orders in deep, confident voices. Surround them, commanded aristocratic. Fall back, snapped suspicious. Tea first, declared dashing. Nigel cleared his throat and announced that he had mislaid a ferret. 3 Death Eaters rounded on one another. Who'd said fall back? You did. I said surround them. Someone said tea. And Nigel, over the top of all of it, repeated his concern about the ferret with mounting urgency. Under cover of the argument, the twins and the courier went over the wall and behind a row of market stalls, rotten awnings flapping overhead while curses punched smoking holes through baskets, counters, and a sign advertising turnips at prices no sensible turnip could justify. Fred flung dashing over his shoulder. It landed on a Death Eater's mask and complemented his cheekbones. A second mustache sprang onto the canary-beaked wizard and pronounced him suspicious, and every tug he gave it only made it grow until within seconds it had wrapped his whole head like a furry scarf and sent him staggering into Hedgeface, whose imaginary hair tangled up with the very real whiskers. From under his arm, the decoy detonator cheered. Their command structure, George called, seemed hairy. Hedgeface tore loose and hurled the detonator across the square. It struck the fountain, bounced once, landed square on its brass feet, and flashed its eyes red. Unauthorized throwing detected, it announced, commencing customer feedback. A panel opened in its back and a storm of paper complaint forms boiled up into the air. Hundreds of them, each armed with a quill that jabbed at the nearest available hand. They demanded names, addresses, reasons for dissatisfaction, preferred refund methods, and whether the attempted murder had occurred before or after purchase. One Death Eater blasted a form apart, and two more appeared to ask whether he'd found the instructions clear. They should charge extra for that, Fred said, admiring the paperwork. They hadn't put that in, George replied. Then who had? The detonator some distance off saluted. Well, across the way the courier reached the shadow of a narrow lane leading north, and two Death Eaters moved to cut it off, both shielding their faces from the aggressive quills. George tore open a packet of pygmy puff dandruff with his teeth, got a mouthful of pink powder, coughed a small cloud, and advised hoarsely that one should never breathe product. Fred snatched the packet and flung the rest under the nearest stall. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the boards began to squeak, and tiny pink tufts sprouted up through the cracks, multiplied and swelled into round, fluffy creatures with enormous eyes and very firm opinions about personal space. Pygmy puffs rolled out by the dozen and bounced across the square like furious pom-poms, fastening onto boots, hems, masks, and wand sleeves, and every time somebody shook one loose, it squealed and split into two smaller ones. A witch kicked at 3 and found herself wearing 6. Another Death Eater vanished from the waist down under a bubbling pink heap that purred while dragging him towards the fountain. Were they dangerous? The courier asked from the lane. Only socially, said Fred. They bit if criticized, George added. And when a Death Eater shouted, "Ridiculous creatures," the whole swarm turned towards him as one, and he lowered his wand and said, "Too late. Charming creatures." They surged over him in a soft, pink wave, and his wand flew loose and landed in the fountain. Hedgeface scrambled onto a stall to escape them, still wrapped in mustache and silver hair, and his boots slid on the complaint forms. He windmilled both arms and caught the hanging bakery sign, which broke and swung him clear across the square, kicking the canary-beaked wizard into a cabbage cart before he came down astride the dry fountain with the decoy detonator perched on his head. For one magnificent second, he looked exactly like the heroic commander of his daydream. Then the falling wand disturbed the fountain, and it went up in a column of freezing water. The silver hair vanished. So did the hedge eyebrows. His mask slid sideways down his face. That, Fred said, wincing, was a difficult look. "North," said George, before he found a mirror. They ran into the lane with the courier. As the fountain kept spraying, the forms kept demanding signatures, and several hundred pygmy puffs began climbing Hedgeface like a pink and affectionate avalanche. His voice rose after them over the splashing, "Stop them!" And from somewhere deep inside the fluff, the decoy detonator answered, "Please rate your pursuit from 1 to 5. The north lane ran exactly 40 yards before it ended at a locked iron gate marked "No Entry" which Fred thought needlessly negative. Beyond it, the road climbed away between hedges into open country, silver with rain and gloriously free of masked lunatics. The courier rattled the gate, then aimed a wand at the lock, and George caught the wand arm. That usually meant an explosion, and they'd already used their best explosion, and behind them the squeal of several hundred pursuing pygmy puffs was swelling by the second. The blasting charm left the lock untouched, and the sign in ruins. No entry tore free, spun through the air, and lodged edge first in a hedge where it now appeared to forbid shrubbery. Much friendlier, Fred said, approving. George tipped what was left of the stock onto the wet stones and counted it. 1 portable swamp, 2 daydream charms, 3 fake wands, 4 spare noses, and half a packet of something called emergency eels. What did emergency eels do? The courier asked. Fred turned the packet over. Emergency dependent, he said. Comforting, said George. The Death Eaters came round the corner in a disordered wave, Hedgeface at the front with his eyebrows mostly washed away, and one pygmy puff still clinging to his mask like a pink boil, and behind him the canary-beaked wizard, the butterbeer-soaked wizard, and a witch wrapped knees to shoulders in complaint forms. A 4th man carried the decoy detonator by one leg. It swung upside down, stamping forms onto his robes and shouting for escalation. Open the gate, Hedgeface said. The courier lifted a wand and said no. Excellent negotiation, Fred murmured. Firm, George agreed. The first curse cratered the cobbles beside them. Another snapped a gate bar clean in half, but left the lock alone, apparently out of professional stubbornness. George pushed a fake wand into the courier's hands. Use this. And the courier caught it, saw the price label, and looked offended. Their own wand worked. Yes, said George, but theirs expected that. The courier raised the fake wand and shouted a spell, and it became a large white parasol. It sprang open hard enough to knock its holder flat, caught the next curse in its lace canopy, and began to spin like a furious windmill, flinging red light into the hedges until leaves exploded on every side. One Death Eater dropped flat while the parasol observed, in a prim, elderly voice, that it was rain before luncheon and murder after tea. Useful, Fred said, seizing the handle. Unusually, said George. The spinning thing dragged Fred 3 yards down the lane before it fetched up against the gate, and its metal tip slid neatly through the broken bar and hooked the latch on the far side. Fred dug in both heels. George grabbed his coat, the courier grabbed George, and together they hauled, while the parasol criticized their posture, and the Death Eaters hurled curses through a blizzard of hedge clippings. The latch lifted, the gate swung inward, and all 3 of them shot through in a tangled heap, still attached to the parasol, which snapped shut on Fred's fingers, called him clumsy, and turned back into a fake wand. Lock it, said George, slamming the gate. It had a hole, the courier pointed out. Decorative hole, said Fred, shaking his hand. Hedgeface shoved his wand through the gap, and George slapped a spare nose onto the tip. The nose inhaled. So did the wand. A tremendous sneeze flung Hedgeface back into the others, in a spray of green sparks, red sparks, and one improbable stream of yellow flowers, and knocked every Death Eater near him off balance. The decoy detonator sailed free of its captor's hand through the broken bar and landed at Fred's feet with a triumphant ding. Returned stock, said Fred. Loyal customer, said George. They ran uphill, but the road gave no cover beyond dripping hedges and a stone milestone that pointed helpfully to 3 places none of them had time to visit. Black robes were already squeezing through the gate one at a time, with a great deal of swearing and several complaints about the nose still fixed to the leader's wand. "They're gaining," the courier said. "Then," said Fred, opening the daydream box as he ran, "they'd give them somewhere nicer to be." He scattered the charms across the road. The silver bubbles rolled downhill, bobbing through the puddles without bursting, each one holding a small, perfect fantasy. A ministry promotion, a table heaped with gold, a cheering crowd, a private island, and one suspiciously specific scene in which a famous Quidditch player asked the dreamer for gardening advice. The first Death Eater stepped on a bubble and froze with both arms raised, whispering "Minister." The next stooped for the gold one and began shoveling mud into his pockets. Hedgeface avoided every one of them. He came up the hill alone, robes torn, mask crooked, wand still wearing its spare nose like a decorative stopper, and the laughter had gone out of his voice. "Enough tricks," he said. The twins stopped. The courier moved between them with a raised wand, but Hedgeface struck first. One curse ripped the wand away and sent it spinning into the ditch, and another shattered the milestone at Fred's shoulder and peppered the road with stone. George's hand closed on the portable swamp, and Hedgeface's wand came level with his chest, and nobody made a joke. Rain ticked against the torn paper wrapping. At Fred's heel, the decoy detonator folded its brass legs and went, for once, completely silent. "Give me the case," Hedgeface said, stepping closer, mud running from the hem of his robe. George looked at Fred. Fred looked at the parcel. Then the emergency eels began to scream inside the sack. The packet split, and a dozen luminous blue eels launched themselves into the air, each in a tiny red helmet, each blowing a whistle and shrieking, "Emergency! Emergency!" before diving straight down Hedgeface's sleeves. He dropped his wand, clapped both arms to his sides, and began to hop in furious little circles as electric sparks crackled out of his collar. Fred snatched up the portable swamp. George grabbed the courier. "Last resort," Fred asked. "Make it enormous," said George. Fred tore the wrapping and hurled the folded green square into the road, where it landed with the innocent flop of a picnic blanket. For half a second, nothing happened, apart from the eels continuing their rescue operation inside Hedgeface's sleeves. Then the square unfolded once, twice, and 6 more times, in directions geometry had never sanctioned. Mud surged across the stones, reeds shot up, and a brown wave picked Hedgeface clean off his boots. The swamp swallowed the whole road. Water slopped from hedge to hedge, carrying lily pads, cattails, 2 startled frogs, and a small wooden sign that read, "Please do not feed the mud." The twins and the courier scrambled onto the stump of the shattered milestone as the bog rolled downhill towards the gate, and the Death Eaters behind it, who were still lost in their daydreams and wholly unprepared for sudden wetlands. The self-appointed minister sat down in the water and opened a cabinet meeting with 3 reeds. "Trial size," George said, staring. "Generous trial," said Fred. He'd flooded the North Road. "Improved it," said Fred. The swamp poured into the ditches, climbed the banks, and filled both hedges with croaking. Enchanted reeds coiled around Death Eater boots and tugged with patient determination, and every time a man swore, the nearest bulrush repeated the word in a tiny, scandalized voice, so that soon the road rang with squeaky obscenities while black-robed wizards hopped, slid, and tried to curse vegetation that kept ducking. Hedgeface surfaced near the gate with an eel still poking from his collar, spat mud through the mouth of his mask, and raised his recovered wand. And a lily pad slapped itself across his eye holes. He tore it away. Another took its place, a third settled on his head, and put out a pink flower that opened wide whenever he shouted. "Control it," the courier called. "Did they pack the control?" George asked. "They'd pack the swamp," Fred said, which was a no. A hump of mud rose under the courier's boots. The stump tilted, and all three slid down into brown water, knee-deep enough to alarm the frogs. Fred caught the leather case before it went under and held it overhead, protecting official secrets. "And excellent tailoring," George added, wringing out the courier's hood. The decoy detonator paddled past on a lily pad, using a complaint form for a sail, saluted the twins, and steered off towards the stranded Death Eaters, announcing a customer demonstration in progress. A brass panel opened along its back and released 6 tiny rubber ducks in black masks, which spread out over the swamp and began quacking orders in pompous voices, one directing Hedgeface into the deep end, another advising the canary-beaked wizard on less flapping and more discipline. The canary-beaked wizard aimed a kick at it, sank to the knee, and pulled his boot free to find the swamp had fitted it with a bright yellow flipper. The other boot followed matched, and the reeds applauded in small, squeaky claps. "Seasonal range," Fred observed, watching him try to march. "Very Mediterranean," said George. A witch finally managed a competent spell, and blue light struck the middle of the swamp and froze a path clear across it from the gate. The Death Eaters cheered and charged onto the ice, made 7 triumphant strides, and then the portable swamp took ice as a personal insult and rolled the frozen path up like a carpet with all 4 of them inside it. The cylinder bounced downhill. Masks, boots, wands, and furious hands pressed against the transparent surface as it gathered speed, smashed the gate, clipped the bakery wall, and rolled on into the square, with Hedgeface stuck to the outside by his robes and the pink flower on his head upright throughout. From somewhere inside came the muffled voice of the imaginary minister declaring an emergency session. "North Road," the courier said, pointing. Now, they waded out through the swamp, pushing past reeds that demanded passwords and lily pads, offering unsuitable financial advice, and at the edge of the spell, the mud let go of their boots with loud kissing noises. Fred climbed onto dry ground and took stock of the sack. 3 fake marks. "Their own?" George asked, brightening. "The prototype set. The ones that projected messages into the sky." "In theory," said Fred. Behind them, the ice cylinder struck the fountain and shattered, spilling Death Eaters out among the pygmy puffs, the paper forms, the rubber ducks, and a brass band that had at last found its conductor. Hedgeface tore the flower off his head and pointed up the hill, roaring for the others to signal. Fred held up a small black disc stamped with a cartoon skull in a party hat and said it was an excellent idea. The fake mark looked almost respectable until Fred pressed the tiny wart beneath the skull. Then it bit his thumb, sneezed purple sparks, and shouted, "Dark and mysterious mode activated." A beam of green light shot up into the clouds above the village and twisted into a gigantic skull. But the snake, meant to pour from its mouth, wore spectacles and promptly tangled round its own neck, and beneath it hung the words, "Terrifying people since tea time." Legibility had improved, George noted. The snake needed confidence, Fred said. It was strangling itself. Relatable. Down in the square, every Death Eater stopped moving. Even the swamp seemed to pause, though one reed went on whispering a particularly rude word it had picked up from Hedgeface, and the masked wizard stared up at the joke projection turning slowly above the rooftops, while a cheerful brass fanfare played from nowhere and the skull winked. That, said the canary-beaked wizard, was not the Dark Mark. "Sharp fellow," Fred called down. "What have you done?" Hedgeface demanded, wand towards the hill. George held up the second disc and explained, "A limited edition fake mark joke product, suitable for parties, family gatherings, and awkward neighborhood disputes." "They manufactured those," the courier said. "Manufacture was a strong word," said Fred. "Release accidentally was closer," said George. The first projection opened its bony mouth and boomed across the whole village. "Attention, loyal minions!" Every masked head snapped up. The snake untangled itself just far enough to unfold a small card, and the skull read from it. Their Dark Lord regretted that tonight's secret operation had been canceled due to rain, poor footwear, and disappointing initiative. Please return all masks to reception. Thunder rolled somewhere off in the dark. The square held its breath, and then one Death Eater said, "Reception?" And the skull nodded gravely and told him to ask for Percival. It would also, it added, validate his broom parking. Hedgeface made a sound that seemed to do his throat some damage. He slashed his wand through the projection, but the curse passed clean through the vapor and struck the church weathercock instead, which spun wildly and began crowing sparks. George pressed the wart on the second disc, and nothing happened. He pressed harder and it vibrated, produced a small puff of smoke, and announced, "Please insert drama." Fred took it, shook it beside his ear, and slapped it against the milestone stump, and a second beam streaked up at an angle to form a second green skull beside the first. This one with an enormous mustache and a snake that looked suspiciously like a feather boa. The two skulls turned to face each other. "Imposter," said the first. "Amateur," said the second. "I am the genuine terrifying symbol. You have spectacles. You have facial upholstery." Below them, the Death Eaters began arguing over which skull carried the real authority, some for the spectacled one, some for the mustache, whose snake had by now started humming a waltz. Hedgeface tried to restore order, and the rubber ducks surrounded his boots, quacking at everyone to choose their Dark Lord, while the pygmy puffs squealed with each vote. Fred eased the courier's case open just enough to slip the third disc inside. A delivery upgrade. The courier snapped it shut. "Absolutely not." "Complimentary," said Fred. "It could explode," said the courier. "Complimentary and exciting," George decided. A red curse tore between their heads. Hedgeface had given up on the debate and was climbing the hill. Robes streaming swamp water, mask smeared with mud, one yellow flipper still fixed over his left boot, and his wand at least was steady. "Give me the case," he said, clipping each word clean, or he'd start removing fingers. Fred's grin went first. George shifted half a step closer to the courier. The hill offered nowhere to duck, and the last of the stock lay scattered behind them in the swamp, and Hedgeface climbed another pace, with his wand tip brightening while the rubber ducks fell silent. Then the third fake mark went off inside the leather case. A muffled voice cried, "Surprise inspection!" The case sprang open, and green smoke burst around the courier and formed a small skull with buck teeth and a paper crown. It shot at Hedgeface, swelled to the size of a wardrobe, and swallowed his upper half in glowing fog, and from inside came frantic coughing and the solemn verdict, "Unsatisfactory minion." "Detected!" Fred grabbed the courier's sleeve, George grabbed the sack, and they ran uphill while Hedgeface staggered in blind circles, wrapped in an enormous buck-toothed skull that followed his every move and listed his failings in bright green letters above his head. Untidy robes, weak delegation, excessive shouting, inadequate swamp awareness. The other two Sky Skulls stopped arguing long enough to pronounce together, "Dismissed." Then every projection vanished at once, leaving Hedgeface alone on the road, soaked and smoking, in one flipper and a single pink pygmy puff, while a last green line hung over him for 3 seconds before it faded. "Please see Percival." At the brow of the hill, Fred glanced back and nodded, satisfied. "Cannon safe," he said. "Tastefully humiliating," George agreed, hoisting the sack. Behind them, Hedgeface roared loudly enough that the weathercock crowed again, and Fred quickened his pace and said, "That sounded like a yes." The north road climbed over the hill, curved between two dripping hawthorn hedges, and ended at a stone bridge barely wide enough for a cart, with open fields beyond it, a dark line of woodland, and the general promise of somewhere else becoming responsible for the evening. They reached it at a run. Twins, courier, and behind them Hedgeface, several other Death Eaters, a flock of rubber ducks, and one determined pygmy Puff, still riding the leader's shoulder. They'd nearly escaped, the courier said, and Fred, eyeing the narrow bridge, remarked that that sort of statement usually cost them a wall. A black-robed figure apparated onto the far side with a crack, then a second, then a third, closing the road ahead with raised wands and cloaks still settling around their boots. The courier stopped so hard that George walked into the leather case. Fred turned to face the pursuit coming up behind. "Surrounded," he said. "Efficiently," said George, almost flattering. "Give us the case," said the Death Eater at the far end of the bridge, one hand out. "Popular case," said Fred. "Should have charged admission," said George. Hedgeface reached the near end, gasping through his crooked mask, the yellow flipper slapping the stones with every step and lending his arrival the dignity of a duck approaching a buffet. "No more products," he snarled. "No more tricks." Fred upended the sack, and a single sugar mouse fell out, stirred itself, and set off paddling through a puddle. "Tragic news," said George, spreading his hands. For once, nobody attacked at once. The courier stood between the two groups with a wand held low, and the Death Eaters closed both ends of the bridge, and the swollen river rushed beneath the arch, carrying twigs, foam, and one of the swamp's rubber ducks. Fred looked at George. George looked at the sugar mouse, and the mouse climbed onto Fred's shoe and saluted. "Of course," Fred murmured and picked it up and wound the little brass spoon on its back. The self-stirring sugar mouse had been built to circle teacups agitate milk, and squeak when the sugar was evenly distributed. This particular one had been rejected for considering everything a beverage. Fred set it on the bridge, and it sniffed the rain, the river, the soaked Death Eaters, and finally the portable swamp spreading over the hill behind them, and its red sugar eyes lit up. "Oh dear," said George. The mouse sprinted downhill. It shot beneath Hedgeface's robes, between the legs of the pursuing wizards, and dived into the advancing swamp with a tiny silver splash. For 2 seconds, nothing changed. Then the whole enchanted bog began to turn. Reeds leaning, lily pads drawing into a spiral, mud revolving around the hill like tea in a cup set upon by an over-enthusiastic spoon. The Death Eaters behind the bridge went off their feet first. Hedgeface spun by upright on a lily pad with his pygmy puff still aboard. 2 witches revolved after him in a cabbage cart. Then the brass band, the fake chicken, and every complaint form that had not yet found a signature, with the rubber ducks circling the lot and quacking for an orderly queue. The spinning swamp reached the bridge, surged beneath the arch, climbed the parapets, and broke over the stones in a wave full of cattails and deeply surprised frogs. The 3 Death Eaters blocking the far side braced themselves. One grabbed another's cloak, the second caught a milestone, and the third seized what he took to be a railing and turned out to be Nigel, who announced that he had found the ferret. All 3 vanished into the whirlpool. Fred caught the courier's arm, and George caught Fred's coat, and they clung to the stone parapet while the swamp revolved around them, carrying black robes, flippers, pink fluff, brass instruments, and increasingly urgent paperwork in widening circles, the sugar mouse riding a floating saucer at the dead center of it all and squeaking, "Needs more sugar." "Could it stop?" the courier shouted. "Probably," Fred shouted back. "When?" called George. Fred watched Hedgeface come round beneath the bridge one more time. After stirring, he said, the mouse gave one final heroic turn, and the swamp let go of everything at once. Death Eaters flew from the spiral like badly aimed fireworks. One into a haystack, one through the roof of a chicken shed, and Hedgeface clean over the bridge, arms spread, to land in a manure cart on the far side, which rolled downhill, gathered speed, and bore him away across the fields with a pink pygmy puff riding his head like a festive hat. The water drained from the road, the mud settled. The brass band came down in perfect formation and finished its march on a triumphant crash of cymbals, and the decoy detonator climbed the bridge parapet, produced one last complaint form, and stamped it final resolution. Somewhere beyond the hedges, Hedgeface shouted things the reeds repeated in tiny scandalized voices. The courier looked the dripping twins up and down and asked who they were. "Local businessmen," said Fred, retrieving the sugar mouse. "Community-minded," said George, fishing Nigel out of the mud. "They'd nearly flooded an entire village," the courier said. "Nearly," Fred repeated, wounded. And George, with a glance back at the rooftops, where a rubber duck was circling the church weathercock, thought it a bit early to assess. The courier tucked the leather case under one arm and set off for the woodland, and after 3 steps, a green skull no bigger than an apple popped out of the lid and said, "Percival thanks you for your custom." The courier stopped, closed both eyes for a moment, and walked on without comment, and the twins followed at an easy stroll with their empty sack swinging between them. Behind them, the manure cart struck a ditch, and a distant voice roared, "Weasleys." Good name recognition, Fred said, smiling. George nodded. Advertising works. They never did tell their mother where they'd really been that night, and the Death Eaters never worked out how a joke shop had made fools of them all. Somewhere in the chaos, the real message was lost for good, which was, of course, the whole point. Fred and George walked home soaked, laughing, and several dozen fake noses the lighter.